Welcome to another video. Today it is the 15th of January and I'm going to keep this video pretty brief because yesterday's video was really a handful, about 30 minutes long, so I recommend watching that if you haven't already. But I'm going to make this one pretty short just to give some updates from today because we do have some changes that are pretty notable. We're going to work our way from the south to the north, so starting out with the area around the water canal from Mayorsk to Donbass. We know that the Russians have been making gains over here over the past few days, but it's been very incremental. I've talked about it before, especially around Rozhar where there's been back and forth fighting. But the Russians were, as I said previously, able to take the fortifications that are adjacent to the water canal, and they were able to advance along this ridge over here in the direction of a town over here called Bilahora, which is manned by the 62nd Mechanized Brigade. So today, after taking the fortifications to the south and also to the west of Klishivka, they were also able to cross the water canal in the southern area and take over this nature reserve. So this nature reserve, it was in a pretty fortified area. You see I had this certain trench marked out from before. It was also acknowledged by the Russian military maps sites as a stronghold, which is how I was able to find it. And now, according to Live UA map, which is you could say it's pretty pro-Ukraine, they've also marked this entire area as under Russian control, and it shows that they're approaching this quarry over here. And so they've taken over a large swath of land just to the north of Bilahora, which puts it in a pretty precarious situation because Russia has a stronghold with the nature reserve to the north, and then there's also pressure coming in from this ridge to the east. So we'll see what happens in Bilahora. The Russians, they did not fall for the trap of advancing along this relatively low elevation and then getting enveloped by the groupings in Bilahora and Delivka. Instead, they went from the north, taking over the fortifications, and then from there advancing onto Bilahora, which juxtaposed to the Russian positions are in pretty low elevation, and so the situation is not looking good for the Ukrainians in this specific area. So look out for what happens here in the coming weeks. Meanwhile, looking back at Klishivka, I don't really have any changes over here. The Russians just continue to apply pressure from the south and from the north. In Opitny, we have some interesting developments. So we finally seen some changes. Now the Russians have been able to advance a few blocks, although I will say that this has been very difficult because Ukraine basically has turned every single house into a fortress. And a lot of these houses over here are high-rise apartments, which is why the advance has been relatively slow. It's been stalled. The Russians, they don't want to conduct these sort of suicidal frontal assaults because when they are conducted, they lead to large amounts of deaths. So whenever they do happen, which sometimes they are necessary in order to overrun the Ukrainian positions, they usually will use the Wagner Group and specifically the recruited prisoners as a means by which to distract the Ukrainians and just grind them down. And then obviously using combined arms, whether it be aviation, artillery, to break through and take over the Ukrainian defensive positions. So something of the sort happened here in Opitny over the past few days. So it's not even Opitny at this point. This is just southern Bakhmut. This is in the Sobachivka district. The Russians were able to take over a drugstore, very small drugstore over here. They were able to take over this gas station. They were able to take over this parking lot over here. They took over a minor soccer stadium, and now they have really cleared out most of the apartment buildings in this area. So now we're reaching an area that is one, less dense, but also with smaller houses, which could allow the Russians to perhaps apply more pressure over here. But Ukraine still has a lot of units in this area. They have the 110th Separate Mechanized Brigade stationed around the dam area. They also have these units over here, 63rd Mechanized Brigade, 53rd Mechanized Brigade, and 71st Jaeger Brigade, which I have to move up a bit north. So now the Russians, they've been able to take all of the floodplain to the east of the Bakhmut Dam. I'm not saying that they have control of the dam itself, but they are basically on the embankment of it. And they are now in a position where they could try to cross over because it is frozen. The ground here is basically frozen. There's footage from Google Earth you could see of how in the winter it's all frozen. I'm not saying that they can move like equipment across, like tanks or infantry fighting vehicles across there, because there's a good chance that the snow would crack and then that or the ice would crack and that all the people would just fall into the water, icy water. But let's say in this like a river area, you could theoretically have the Russians crossing over the ice because it is very narrow over there. I don't know how much it is. If I had to estimate, it was like 10, 20 meters wide. So it's really not that much. And they probably wouldn't be spotted during that time. So they could theoretically cross over from here and apply pressure from the east onto the Ukrainian positions in these residential areas. But that's just speculation. Now, the Russians have also been applying pressure in this certain area. The Ukrainians have been holding off a lot of Russian assaults. You have the 4th Rapid Reaction Brigade, which has been responsible for drone attacks and artillery attacks on the Wagner Group. So they've inflicted some pretty heavy casualties on the advancing Wagner Group units, especially the prisoners that are being used to storm some of these facilities. So you have a lot of parking lots and a lot of garbage-related facilities. Here's the quarry over here. I think this is related to the garbage dump. And so the fighting is going on around here. There's reports of shelling in this direction by the Russians. So we know that there's fighting going on pretty close to the Bakhmut Dam, even from the north. And you have the 57th Motorized Brigade trying to hold the line over here. They've done a pretty good job at this. The Russians have really only been able to advance in this general open area over here where there's a pond, there's a few relatively low elevation areas. It's pretty grassy over here if you look at the images on Google Maps. And then you also have some quarries over here. And this again could be used to try to infiltrate deeper into the Zabakhmutka district where the Russians are fighting right now. But again, I think for the most part this is just meant to pin down Ukrainian forces more than anything else as the real battles go on along the flanks. And speaking of flanks, the Russians have advanced on Bakhmut's northern flank, taking over a lot of these forested areas over here. So the Russians already had the high ground after clearing out the Ukrainian positions in some of these hills to the east of Bakhmut, where you also had the Foreign Legion fighting. I'm going to circle it for you guys. So now using these positions, they were able to, first of all, clear all of the pressure to the north of the industrial district. So you had this Ukrainian axis over here that was eliminated. And because of that, the Ukrainians are now forced to launch assaults onto the art winery, like straight on from the east, or you could say from the west, attacking the east. And as a result, the Russians have now tried to strengthen their flanks. So they sent units to this area, taking over some of the lower elevation areas using support from mortars and such from the high ground. And they were able to infiltrate some of the residential blocks in this area. So now there's fighting in Silakatnaya Street as they are trying to apply pressure to the Skala Intelligence Battalion, which is operating in this general area. There's also the 214th Separate Special Battalion. Yeah, they're just doing that as a means by which to strengthen the situation in Industrial District because the art winery is now contested because of Ukraine's assaults in this certain area. But again, no major changes besides that. In Krasnohora, I'm inclined to believe that the Ukrainians are retreating from here. I don't have concrete evidence of this, but it would make sense because, first of all, the Russian maps are showing that Russia's chipping away at the Ukrainian control over here. And if their narrative of the situation is correct, then really the entirety of the flanks are under Russian control, which makes it very difficult for Ukraine to retreat. There's only really one road they could use to leave, and that would probably be under Russian fire control by now. So I'm inclined to believe that for the most part, Ukraine has withdrawn from this area and that really the town itself is just a gray zone at this point. You could look at some of the Ukrainian maps. They also probably confirm this. If you look, it's sort of just in between the Ukrainian line, which is centered around the cities of Parasukivka, Blahodatne, and the high ground just to the west, and the Russian line, which is now going to cautiously enter Krasnohora. So I don't know the status of the Ukrainian stronghold over here, but I do know that just to the north, the Russians have been advancing along the Bakhmutovka River. It's a very narrow river, as I said before. In this area, it's even narrower. In some areas, we wouldn't even be able to tell from an aerial view that it exists. But you can see that it's pretty close to Blahodatne and that the Russians are approaching the town, trying to attack it. And as I've been saying this, you can now see the Ukrainians are trying to regroup. This is just a general area where there are defensive lines. We could look at some of the satellite imagery from recent days. We see that there are Ukrainian attempts at fortifying this certain area As I said in my previous video, they're probably not permanent. The goal is just to slow Russia down and to prevent them from gaining momentum to fully encircle Bakhmut. So they're trying to buy time right now by setting up these fortifications. So now you have some units set up over here. And because the Ukrainians have withdrawn to these higher elevated areas, the Russians have taken full control of the suburb of Dvorichnya, which is over here. So today it was reported, and this is something that was actually reported by a Ukrainian aerial reconnaissance commander, some guy called Robert Magyar. I hope I'm saying that correctly. He said that the Ukrainians had retreated from the suburbs of Soledar and that the salt mine number 7, which is the salt mine over here, was now under Russian control. And you could look at his previous post 2 days ago. He said that it was under their control. So something's clearly changed within those 2 days. Now, in regards to the train station, even if you look at the Russian maps, they still say that it's contested. So there's no reason for me to change the map over here. So you still have some sort of Ukrainian resistance being offered in the northern part of the Sil district. Now, moving on to the situation around Rozdolivka and Vesely, the Russians, they have been able to move the front line a little bit around this rail line over here. Previously, Ukraine had a lot of entrenched positions that were really difficult to dislodge, and they really hadn't been dislodged for, you could say, many months, ever since Russia reached the Lysychansk-Bakhmut road. And in recent days, due to all of these changes to the front line, Ukraine's been stretched out. They've had to transfer troops around, so it's given Russia the opportunity in some of these areas to utilize their advantage in artillery. They might also be using thermobaric weapons in certain specific areas where there are a lot of trenches, where there are a lot of fortified areas, to break through the lines. And now they've been able to reach the rail line, where you have these bushes that are surrounding the rail line. This makes it more difficult to defend Vesely because it's going to be attacked from the east and from the south. And because Vesely is just very small right now, and it's very difficult to resupply at this point, because Russia probably has fire control over the supply lines leading into Vesely, they might have to withdraw from here in small groups. And then if that happens, then it would put pressure on Rozdolivka, which is already being attacked from the south. So that, again, would make it difficult for Ukraine to mount a successful defensive operation in the town. So that's the situation right now. In terms of the unit doing that, we have the 35th Separate Guards Motor Rifle Brigade, which was around Vrivka. I don't know if it is anymore, but it was in the general area. Also have the VDV. A lot of the units that were operating in Kherson from the VDV, they have now been moved to Bakhmut, and they're really playing an ancillary role supporting the Wagner frontal assaults, or actually the LPR frontal assaults, because LPR 6th Motorized Rifle Regiment, they were also involved in fighting around Soledar. They weren't the main force, but they were involved. And for that reason, I also think that the 4th Motorized Regiment of the LPR was involved in the fighting over here and around Vesely, just like they are around Spirny right now. So here's the 4th Motorized Brigade. They're really fighting in the sector, making up a lot of the work, while Russia is mainly on the rear or in other fronts like Svatove, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. So that's really it for today in terms of the front line. Thank you all for watching.